Well, thank you for that welcome. It's always good to have a Catholic girl back in familiar territory. It is a great privilege to be invited to give the Maurice Blackburn Oration and to be the first from the Northern Territory to do so. So my thanks to the Moreland City Council for the invitation, and I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people on whose land we meet tonight. Now, being the first Northern Territorian to deliver this prestigious oration, I thought it only appropriate to bring a Northern Territory perspective with me, a perspective that comes from living and working in the North for nearly 30 years and being a member of the Territory Parliament for 13 of those and 6 of those years as Chief Minister. So my subject tonight, and it's one that I hope will be thoroughly approved of by both Maurice and Doris Blackburn, is an issue of equity. Is it fair and just that Northern Territorians, all 230,000 of us, are second-class citizens? And if, as I contend, that we are second-class citizens, what does that actually mean? How have those lesser rights affected the course of Territory history? What effect has there been on our political institutions, our political effectiveness and engagement, and importantly, what effect on our community, especially Aboriginal Territorians, who make up a third of the Territory's population? So I thought I'd needed to give you some Territory context to start with. For much of our history since European settlement, the Territory has been unloved, a bit of an orphan. From the 1820s, we were first under the control of the colony of New South Wales. Then in 1863, we were handed to the South Australians. For 48 years, we were the Northern Territory of South Australia, but eventually we proved too much for them, and we were traded in 1911 to the Commonwealth in exchange for a railway to Darwin and some payments of Territory debts. From a Territory point of view, there's little affection for the Commonwealth and its period of direct administration. Being governed remotely from Canberra just didn't work. It didn't work for Aboriginal Territorians who resented the Welfare Ordinance of 1953 and wanted recognition of their land rights, just as it didn't work for white and Chinese Territorians. The agitation for a greater say in governing ourselves grew rapidly, particularly following the end of World War II. So jump forward to 1970s, Gough Whitlam, and a most welcome commitment from the Federal Labor Party to self-government for the Northern Territory. But that self-government could have been statehood. Campaigning in Darwin in 1975, Malcolm Fraser, who was then the opposition leader, offered the Territory statehood in 5 years if he won the coming election. It was an offer that caught our politicians by surprise. Their energy was focused on establishing all aspects of the Territory administration, its revenue, its legislation and a public service. Statehood just seemed a bridge too far, and the offer wasn't taken up. Looking back, and of course with the wisdom of hindsight, it was such a lost opportunity. Instead of more than 30 years of a lesser status of Territory, we would have begun our self-governing life as Australia's 7th state, with the full powers of a state in managing our land and our people and our resources. So why did Territorians, 20 years after that Fraser offer, vote no in the 1998 referendum for statehood? It's a very pertinent question. And yes, we did, by a small margin, vote no to something the majority of us wanted in principle. Put simply, too many questions about the detail of what it would mean were left unanswered. The move to a referendum was rushed and dominated by the then Chief Minister. The community was left behind and expressed their discontent by voting no. Again, for Territorians, another lost opportunity, and the result, we stayed, in a constitutional sense, second class. So what does this second class actually mean? Well, it's like this. As a Territory, we're a creation of the Federal Parliament and only exist through its goodwill and delegated powers. It can disallow Territory legislation if it so chooses, and has done that a number of times in the last 15 years. the first and most controversial disallowance was the rights of the terminally ill legislation in 1997. The Federal Parliament also determines the number of senators we have. The states, Victoria has 12, we have 2. Tasmania, for example, has just over twice our population, but 6 times the number of senators. We also have a much reduced role in referenda. Like our cousins in that other territory, the ACT, our votes only contribute to the national total. So, being a territory means our legislation can be overturned, we don't have equal Senate numbers in Canberra, and our vote is just about invisible in referenda. But as they say, there's more. In 1978 and in subsequent years, the Commonwealth didn't hand over full administrative powers to the new territory government. The Aboriginal Land Rights Act, that only applied in the Northern Territory, was held as Commonwealth legislation. Our 2 best-known parks, Uluru and Kakadu, were managed by, and still managed by, the Commonwealth's Australian National Parks and Wildlife Service. We didn't control uranium mining, and we didn't have our own industrial relations system. They both stayed with the Commonwealth. Not surprisingly, the Commonwealth's decision to reserve those specific powers was resented by successive territory governments. Why, when the territory was building its own parks estate, could it not be trusted to manage Uluru and Kakadu? Why, when the territory was controlling mining of minerals such as bauxite and manganese, could it not do so with uranium, as the South Australians did, especially since the Commonwealth controlled all uranium export permits? And why, when the territory ran its own land administration and sacred sites legislation, could it not administer that iconic and unique piece of legislation, the Land Rights Act? It was and still is legislation unique to the territory, because Bob Hawke's attempts to establish national land rights in the 80s were rejected by the states. The Territory Government argued that the Land Rights Act could be both Commonwealth and Territory legislation, identical acts, but that its administration should be done by the Northern Territory. It was a good argument because it would have made the Northern Territory Government a participant rather than a bystander in the land claim process, and put it properly at the table with land councils and the federal government. However, that proposal fell on unreceptive ears. From the Territory's point of view, those reserved powers reinforced a second-class status and were the cause of some of the worst outbreaks of hostilities between successive Territory governments and the Commonwealth. Think the return of Uluru to the traditional owners in the early 80s. Think of Kakadu, its establishment as a national park, of Coronation Hill, World Heritage listing and uranium resources. Think of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act and Territory governments year after year having to put what was called the detriment case on each and every land claim to the Commonwealth's Land Commissioner, and earning an unflattering reputation for being both anti-Aboriginal and anti-land rights. I'm not arguing that Territory politicians always behaved well. They didn't. Legislation had to be developed, passed and administered, budgets managed, revenue raised, a full range of services delivered to the community, and economies developed. The Territory's particular challenge was its size, a sixth of Australia, its very small population, more than a quarter of which was Aboriginal, and the very poor condition of most of the infrastructure that was inherited from the Commonwealth after 70 years. The first Chief Minister, Paul Everingham, described the state of the Aboriginal communities he inherited as pretty disgraceful. So for nearly 20 years after self-government, the Territory Parliament got on with its task of developing, debating and passing the full suite of legislation demanded of a contemporary jurisdiction, most of it uncontroversial, or at least not controversial enough to trigger disallowance by the Commonwealth. That changed after our Parliament passed the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act in May 1995. It took the country by surprise when groundbreaking legislation emerged from the Northern Territory, but the man responsible, then Chief Minister Marshall Perrin, believed the terminally ill should at least have a choice about how and when they died. It was a tough issue for the Territory Parliament, a conscience vote that produced passionate and angry debate. The bill only passed by one vote, but it was legislation that was careful, considered, conservative, and strongly supported by a majority of Territorians and by a majority of Australians. Opponents of the legislation, even after it was passed, didn't give up. They challenged the law in the Territory's Supreme Court and they lost. Next, they asked Prime Minister Paul Keating to exercise his executive veto power to overturn a Territory law within the first 6 months. He refused, saying the legislation was a matter for the Territory, not for the federal government. So the legislation beat its first two challenges, but the third, going to the heart of the Territory's constitutional weakness, proved fatal for the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act. Our ability to pass such legislation was overridden by an amendment to our Self-Government Act. It was the Kevin Andrews Private Members Bill, and in a conscious vote, it passed both houses of federal parliament. Not even the Senate, supposedly the states, and we always hope the Territory's House as well, supported the Territory's right to enact such legislation. Territorians, even those who did not support voluntary euthanasia, were irked that legislation passed legitimately in our parliament could be overturned in Canberra. Remember, this was the first time it had happened. It turned attention to our second-class constitutional status and certainly revitalised interest in Territory statehood. Not long after that, another piece of legislation caught the attention of federal parliament: mandatory sentencing for property crime. Under this legislation, a first conviction for a property crime offence meant a mandatory 14 days in jail, with a second and third offence 3 months and then a year. Concern about the legislation and its disproportionate impact on Aboriginal Territorians again raised the possibility of federal intervention to disallow the law. The majority of public opinion in the Territory and in most of Australia, except here in Victoria, supported this one-strike legislation, but moves to overturn it grew in federal parliament, led by Labor and a small number of Liberal backbenchers. The trigger for federal action was the suicide in jail of a 15-year-old Aboriginal youth who was serving time for a minor property offence. Prime Minister Howard called in then Chief Minister Denis Burke and worked out a compromise that exempted juveniles from the legislation and funded juvenile diversion programs. It was a compromise that satisfied the federal politicians who'd been moving to disallow the legislation. John Howard said at the time that it was important to respect the rights of the Territory Parliament, those same rights that had been trampled only a few years before over voluntary euthanasia. I was opposition leader when the debate was raging about mandatory sentencing. It was a very difficult time for Labor because although we strongly opposed the legislation, we were equally strongly against any interference in our laws from federal parliament. I remember arguing with my federal colleagues that the best way to remove the legislation was to remove the Country Liberal Party government. Some of them laughed, believing I was deluded and that since Labor had never been in government in the Territory, it never would be. As you can imagine, it was a seriously memorable day for the Territory's first Labor government when we repealed mandatory sentencing. We didn't have any sense of being second class that day. But it wasn't long before the lesser status emerged again. This time it was over a national nuclear waste facility, which although all jurisdictions said, yes, we need it, nobody wanted it in their backyard. From the 1980s, federal governments have been trying to find an appropriate location. The search had bipartisan support, and for 12 years, there was a thorough scientific assessment made of various locations across the country. A decision was finally made that an area near Woomera in South Australia was the most appropriate. It didn't go down well in South Australia. The state government quickly declared a national park and then challenged the Commonwealth decision in the High Court and won. So, with the Woomera solution defeated, the Howard government needed to find somewhere else to store nuclear waste. Time was running out. The suspicion grew that the Northern Territory would be targeted, and it became an election issue in the 2005 federal campaign. However, there was relief when the coalition promised that the country's nuclear waste would not be forced on us. As Chief Minister, I wasn't ideologically opposed to it being built in the Territory, but always argued that science should determine the best site, and if that was in my jurisdiction, then so be it. But that's not how it unfolded. Post-election, any pretence at science was thrown away, along with that very temporary election promise, and the Howard government just headed for the place that could be safely constitutionally bullied. 3 Territory locations were identified, not for their suitability as safe sites for nuclear waste, but because the Commonwealth owned the land, and the land was in the Northern Territory. Gone was the careful science, abandoned because it was so much easier to force the country's nuclear waste on us. The decision was an affront to the Territory, and our response was a piece of legislation that banned the transport and storage of nuclear waste in the Territory, other than the nuclear waste that we generated locally. The Howard government responded with an appalling piece of legislation that took overriding the Territory to a new level. The legislation allowed them to establish a nuclear waste facility and be able to ignore any local or Commonwealth legislation that might get in the way: environment, heritage, even the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, and removed any right we might have had to appeal. While I was the Chief Minister, all the state and territory leaders were Labor. We were quite a cohesive team. We worked together well, supported and rallied around for each other. Not this time. If the federal government, even a coalition government, could insist that a nuclear waste facility be built in the Northern Territory, then what a relief. A problem conveniently solved for all the state colleagues. They all supported statehood for us in theory, but were pleased our continuing territory status had solved a very tricky issue for them. It was not going to be in their backyards. So what happened to the nuclear waste facility? Well, the initial 3 sites weren't suitable, the Commonwealth cast around for new possibilities, and a group of traditional owners outside Tennant Creek at Muckaty Station offered their land. That offer has caused much local grief because other traditional owners of the same land are strongly objecting. It's currently in the courts. The sadness in the tale of the nuclear waste facility is that such a site needs to be determined by the best science and not by political opportunity. Traditional owners in Central Australia shouldn't be fighting over it. It should be scientists with good evidence presenting the decision makers with the most appropriate and safest site. Tennant Creek just happens to be one of this country's most earthquake-prone locations. Fairness, justice and good scientific sense continue to be cast aside over the nuclear waste facility. That story is not finished. But those actions pale into insignificance when compared with John Howard in 2007 with his Northern Territory emergency response. Again, a serious issue, this time of child sexual abuse in the Northern Territory's Aboriginal communities. It was turned into a political opportunity to try and save a failing government. Aboriginal people became convenient pawns in this electoral game, and fairness and good policy simply ended up as collateral damage. Now, there's been much written and discussed about the Howard emergency response, but tonight in this oration, given to celebrate the work of 2 champions of human rights,